Welcome to American History, Lesson 25. The U.S. enters World War II. Our lesson objectives are: identify what actions the U.S. took to prepare for war, identify key medical and weapons created to wage World War II, identify important moments and battles during World War II, identify the political, social, and economic changes during World War II. Rebuilding America's Armed Forces. The United States understood that fighting a war on two fronts required large numbers of soldiers. About 5 million volunteered to enter the armed forces, and another 10 million were drafted as the war progressed. After 8 weeks of basic training, former civilians became soldiers before being sent to either the European or Pacific combat zones. Among these soldiers were about 500,000 Mexican Americans, 1 million African Americans, and many thousand Asian and Native Americans. To free more men for combat, the Army created the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, WAAC. About 250,000 women served in the military, though they did not receive the same pay benefits as male soldiers. The nation's factories converted from peacetime to wartime production. Automakers made planes, tanks, and other vehicles, while shipyards built warships. About 18 million workers, one-third of them women, kept these war industries productive and filled many roles previously performed by men. African Americans pushed for equal access to jobs in war industries and won many opportunities. The government recruited scientists to develop new weapons and medicines. This effort produced radar, sonar, penicillin, and other drugs, and the atomic bomb. The government created the Office of Price Administration, OPA. The OPA froze the prices of consumer goods and issued ration books, restricting access to limited goods such as gasoline and meat. Most Americans cooperated with rationing, with many freedom gardens being planted to ease consumer demand. They bought war bonds and collected scrap paper or metal to help the soldiers fighting overseas. The U.S. government feared that Americans of Japanese descent may be working with Japan, so they confined about 110,000 Japanese Americans in internment camps. Two-thirds of those confined were United States citizens. President Franklin Roosevelt met with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in late 1941. They agreed to concentrate their efforts first on defeating Hitler's Germany, also called the European Theater. They agreed that they would accept only unconditional surrender. The U.S. in the European and Pacific war zones. At first, many U.S. ships were destroyed by German submarines, which prevented vital weapons and supplies to reach England. Eventually, the Allies won the Battle of the Atlantic by using convoys, merchant and troop transport ships would gather in large groups and cross the Atlantic under the protection of warships, radar to sink submarines, and by relying on the tremendous output of American shipyards. The German attack on the Soviet Union, begun in 1941, stalled in early 1942. The German army hoped to move to take Stalingrad and oil fields in the south with the speed they conquered much of Europe with, but the Soviet army trapped a large German force in Stalingrad and continually reinforced their army, preventing the Germans from advancing. In February 1943, the German army was shattered and the remnants surrendered. Shortly after, the Americans and British pushed the Germans out of North Africa. The Allies moved forward into Europe by planning to launch an invasion across the Mediterranean Ocean. The Americans and British next captured Sicily, leading the war-weary Italian king to overthrow dictator Benito Mussolini. Hitler seized control of Italy and dug in to fight. The Allies' advance through Italy was slow and bloody. Meanwhile, the Americans and British launched a massive invasion to liberate Western Europe. Landing on June 6, 1944 in northern France, the Allies forced the Germans off the coast and began to advance eastward. By August, they had liberated Paris, and by the fall, they had entered Germany. The Germans began a massive counterattack to repel the invading armies in December. They cut deeply into Allied lines at first, but the Allies responded quickly with fresh soldiers and reinforced those positions that managed to withstand the German attack. This battle was called the Battle of the Bulge, consisting of Germany's final ability to launch an offensive. At the same time, the Soviets entered Germany from the east. As the Allied armies advanced, they found the death camps that the Nazis had built to kill millions of Jews and others. The Soviets reached Berlin in April 1945. Hitler committed suicide rather than be captured, and a week later Germany surrendered. Fun fact: British Lieutenant Colonel John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, or Mad Jack as he was known, fought in World War II using a longbow and sword. Churchill, of no apparent relation to Winston Churchill, once said that any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. Mad Jack was known to play his bagpipes in battle and once captured 42 German soldiers captive with just his sword. After serving time as a German captive, he desired to fight in Japan but arrived 2 days after Japan surrendered. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan captured large parts of Asia and the Pacific. The United States lacked the strength they showed in the European theater at first, but they were determined to strike back. First, there was a token air raid on Tokyo that lifted American spirits. Then there were real victories in the battles of Coral Sea and Midway, stopping planned Japanese invasions and causing devastating damage to the Japanese fleets. The Japanese lost valuable aircraft carriers, planes, and crew they lacked the ability to replace. U.S. strategy called for bypassing the major Japanese strongholds and attacking less well-defended islands. Then airfields were built to launch air attacks on enemy supply lines. The Americans took Guadalcanal in 1943 and gradually moved northwest, recapturing the Philippines in 1944. Next was the extremely bloody battle for Iwo Jima. A new president continues the fight. As Americans neared Japan, President Roosevelt died. Vice President Harry S. Truman took over while the United States won a costly battle in Okinawa. U.S. leaders feared similar high casualties if Japan itself had to be invaded. President Truman learned of the secret effort to develop an atomic bomb. Scientists were split over whether to use the bomb on Japan, but Truman decided to authorize using the weapon. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, leveling the city. When the Japanese did not surrender, another bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Finally, the Japanese agreed to end the war. Before he died, Roosevelt had met with Churchill and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin at Yalta. They discussed the shape of the post-war world and agreed to create a new international organization, the United Nations, to perform the task the League of Nations failed in. In April 1945, the United Nations officially came into existence. The Allies took steps to punish the Nazi and Japanese leaders they held responsible for the war and for cruel treatment of prisoners and civilians. The United States occupied Japan, helping create a democratic government. World War II and the immediate impact on America. The economy boomed during World War II and workers' wages rose significantly. Farmers enjoyed good weather and high demand for their crops, enabling them to thrive. The share of women in the workforce rose to 35%. Many Americans relocated, moving to find the growing defense jobs in the Middle Atlantic states, Michigan, Florida, and the Pacific Coast states. Rapid urban growth led to a housing shortage. People had to adjust to new family situations. The marriage rate boomed during the war, as did the divorce rate after servicemen returned to civilian life. Single mothers juggled jobs and child rearing. Congress passed a law called the GI Bill of Rights, allowing former servicemen to attend college or technical school with paid tuition. African American soldiers were placed in segregated units, but some of these segregated units won many medals. At home during the war, large numbers of African Americans got well-paid, paying skilled jobs, but racial tension erupted into violence in many cities, notably Detroit in 1943. Many communities tried to improve race relations. Mexican-American soldiers fought bravely and won many honors, while Mexican-American civilians suffered discrimination and violence. Japanese Americans suffered the most. Their homes, businesses, and possessions were taken when they were sent to internment camps. Young males joined the army to show their loyalty. Others sued the government to end the internment, but the courts refused to accept the cases. The United States government finally made compensation payments to the Japanese Americans held in internment camps in 1988. What next? Take the time to go back and review the lesson on your own. After your review, complete the lesson review for the lesson and submit for grading. Remember, your submission should follow all the rules for standard written English. All submissions must be written in your own words and sources used cited at the end. How to cite sources in APA format. When you reference a source within an APA-style paper, whether it is using a direct quote, repurposing an image, or simply referring to an idea or theory, you should insert an in-text citation, the author's surname, and the date of publication within parentheses, straight after a direct quote. CitationMachine.net will assist you in creating citations.